At 4:50 in the morning, on February 21, 1943, Brigadier General Paul Robinett stood inside a shallow wadi 20 miles east of Tébessa, Tunisia. Ahead of him, German panzers gathered for an attack he knew would arrive within hours. They belonged to Erwin Rommel, the desert commander who had pushed British armies back and had just spent 3 days driving American forces through Kasserine Pass. Now Rommel was turning toward Tébessa, the main Allied supply hub. If he reached it, he could trap thousands of American troops and seize the fuel and ammunition his Afrika Korps desperately needed. Robinett commanded Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division. He had fewer than 50 Sherman tanks, around 30 tank destroyers, 3 infantry battalions, and 11 artillery batteries. Rommel brought elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions and parts of the Italian Centauro Division, roughly 100 tanks plus supporting units. In numbers, the two sides were not far apart, but in experience they were worlds apart. Rommel's troops had been fighting in the desert for 2 years. They knew how to move, how to combine tanks and infantry, how to use artillery and terrain to break an enemy. The Americans had been in real combat for 9 days. Most had never fought, Germans never taken artillery, never watched their friends fall. Rommel expected them to break again. His early notes said the Americans were green, poorly led, and easily rattled. The previous days supported that view. On February 14th, the Germans struck at Sidi Bou Zid and smashed Combat Command A. The American infantry had been too widely dispersed on separate hilltops, unable to support one another. German armor bypassed the hills, surrounded them, and attacked the tanks in the open. American tank doctrine at that time trained units to fight enemy armor alone, without close infantry or artillery support. German doctrine fused all arms together, and that difference was fatal. The Germans hit simultaneously from 2 sides, crushed American positions and left dozens of Shermans burning. By the next day, a second American counterattack was shredded by hidden German anti-tank guns before it ever reached effective range. Nearly 100 American tanks were lost in 48 hours. Retreat turned into confusion. At Sbeitla on February 17th, the withdrawal collapsed into a road jam, and German artillery struck the packed columns. Vehicles burned on the roadside, and the 1st Armored Division lost more tanks, artillery pieces, and half-tracks. After 4 days of fighting, it had lost half its equipment and much of its confidence. Survivors pulled back to Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap leading toward Tébessa. Rommel pursued, striking again on February 19th. The forward defense collapsed, and American units fell back another 6 miles. By the evening of February 20th, Rommel controlled the pass and could see the road to Tébessa open before him. He needed fuel and ammunition, but German High Command ordered him to push toward Thala instead. Rommel disliked the plan but divided his forces anyway, weakening both attacks. This was when Robinett entered the battle. He received vague orders: move north and hold somewhere east of Tébessa. No one could tell him exactly where or what scale of attack to expect. So he went forward himself, driving for hours through the terrain to select ground that could be defended. He found it in the Bahiret Fusana Valley, flat open floor for approaching German armor, wadis for concealing American tanks hull down, and ridgelines with long fields of view for artillery observers. The terrain forced attackers into obvious routes and gave defenders every advantage. Robinett placed his tanks low in the wadis so only their turrets showed. He positioned tank destroyers forward to fire first and fall back. He set his infantry along the flanks and high ground, protecting the armor from German infiltration. And he spent hours with his artillery commander preparing pre-registered fire zones that could be triggered quickly. 11 artillery batteries were positioned so they could mass fire on any part of the valley. Every likely German path was mapped and numbered. He gathered his officers on the night of February 20th, explained the defensive plan in detail, and ensured every unit knew how to communicate. Exhausted soldiers dug in through the night. Many had just survived a week of defeats. Robinett walked among them and quietly explained how the ground favored them if they held their positions. At dawn on February 21st, German scouts probed the line and reported back that American forces were dug in stronger than expected. Rommel believed he could still break them. At 2 p.m., 40 German tanks advanced with Italian infantry in trucks behind them. They expected the same panic they had seen all week. Instead, they were met by coordinated fire. Tank destroyers opened first, then fell back. Shermans hidden in the wadis opened from multiple angles. Artillery crashed down on the Italian infantry and trucks. The German advance stalled and casualties rose. Rommel personally rode forward to see what had gone wrong. The Americans were no longer collapsing. They were fighting from deliberate, prepared positions. He ordered a second attack the next day, this time with more tanks. Fog delayed the assault until late morning, but when the German armor pushed up the valley again, the American defense repeated its performance. Panzers reached within 2 miles of the American artillery positions before Robinett unleashed his full concentration. All 11 batteries fired at once. The valley floor erupted under thousands of shells. Tanks burned, infantry scattered, Italian units were shattered. The attack died where it stood. By late afternoon, on February 22nd, Rommel realized he could not break through. Reports from elsewhere said British forces were advancing from the south and Allied reinforcements arriving from the north. His fuel was almost gone. At 4 o'clock, he ordered a withdrawal back through Kasserine Pass. The offensive was over. The Germans withdrew through February 23rd and 24th, and Allied forces reclaimed the pass on February 25th. By every simple measurement, the Americans had suffered a terrible defeat. More than 6,000 casualties, almost 200 tanks lost, hundreds of vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Yet the result was not what Rommel expected. In his journal after the battle, he wrote that the American defense in the final days had been first class. They had recovered faster than he anticipated, grouped their reserves well, and used their artillery with surprising skill. He had expected an untrained, disorganized enemy. Instead, he saw troops who were learning at extraordinary speed. Most German officers misread the battle. They focused on the early days, burning American tanks, prisoners captured, and miles of ground gained. They assumed this proved American forces were weak and would remain weak. Rommel saw the whole picture. He had watched the change happen in real time. On February 14th, Americans fell apart at Sidi Bou Zid. On February 17th, they faltered again at Sbeitla. But by February 21st, they were holding firm east of Tébessa, fighting with coordination they hadn't shown earlier. That rapid improvement unsettled him. It meant the Americans were not like the other armies he had fought. They absorbed lessons quickly, corrected mistakes fast, and adapted faster than he had ever seen British or French forces adapt. Rommel warned his superiors that the Americans would become dangerous opponents once they gained experience. He knew they had advantages Germany could not match: strong logistics, abundant equipment, and massive industrial support. Once those advantages were paired with competent battlefield performance, Germany's position would deteriorate rapidly. But German High Command dismissed his warnings. They preferred the comforting belief that American troops were soft and poorly led. The statistics from the first days at Kasserine reinforced that illusion, and many German officers clung to it. While German command misread the battle, American commanders took its lessons seriously. They understood why the early defeats happened. They saw the consequences of fragmented formations and poor coordination. They saw how scattered infantry and unsupported tanks were easily isolated and destroyed. They saw that artillery, when effectively organized, had become their most decisive weapon. The first lesson was the need for combined arms. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and tank destroyers had to act together, not separately. Tanks needed infantry to protect them from close assault. Infantry needed tanks for firepower. Artillery needed forward observers to guide its fire properly. At Sidi Bou Zid and Sbeitla, the Americans had fought each arm separately and paid dearly. At Tébessa, Robinett aligned everything into a single system: tanks hidden in wadis, infantry guarding the flanks, observers on the ridges, artillery ready to hit pre-mapped points instantly. That integration stopped Rommel's advance cold. The second lesson was positioning. Units had to be close enough to support each other and placed where fields of fire overlapped. The earlier defeats came because American infantry were placed on isolated hilltops too far apart to help each other. At Tébessa, every unit supported the next. Third came artillery. It was now clear that American artillery, when given proper preparation and direction, was the most effective tool they possessed. The massed fire on February 21st and 22nd had devastated German tank formations. But it only worked because observers were well placed, fire missions rehearsed, and batteries organized under a strong direction center. The fourth lesson was leadership. Confusion at the top had crippled the early battles. The relief of Major General Fredendall and the arrival of George Patton marked a turning point. Patton immediately imposed clarity, discipline, and coordination. He demanded commanders know their missions, their units, and their support relationships. Officers who could not answer his questions were replaced. Standards tightened. Training resumed even at the front. Soldiers saw that leadership had shifted from confusion to decisiveness, and morale jumped almost immediately. The final lesson was preparation over improvisation. Early American responses were rushed and disorganized. At Tébessa, the difference came from Robinett spending 2 days studying the ground, positioning his units carefully, and rehearsing fire missions. That preparation transformed a fragile force into a coherent defense capable of stopping Germany's most experienced desert army. With these lessons absorbed, Patton rebuilt 2 corps rapidly. Training intensified. Combined arms drills became daily routine. Artillery units mapped every inch of terrain they would fight on. Tank destroyers practiced ambush tactics from concealment rather than charging into open ground. Engineers rehearsed clearing obstacles and supporting mobile attacks. Within weeks, the American force that had retreated in confusion was functioning as a unified, confident army. By mid-March 1943, 2 corps returned to offensive operations. They advanced methodically, captured Gafsa, then El Guettar. On March 23rd, at El Guettar, the same German panzer division that crushed American armor at Sidi Bou Zid attacked again. This time, the Americans stopped them decisively. Artillery and tank destroyers destroyed nearly 30 German tanks in a single engagement. It was the first time American forces had halted a major German armored attack on their own. Rommel was already gone by then, evacuated to Germany for medical reasons, but he heard the reports. The Americans who had collapsed at Kasserine were now holding firm, fighting with coordination and discipline. The transformation had occurred exactly as he predicted, and it confirmed his larger fear. Once the Americans gained experience, their logistical and industrial strength would make them overwhelming. That rapid evolution defined the rest of the North African campaign. Through late March and April 1943, American forces continued to gain confidence. They refined their use of artillery, improved coordination between infantry and tanks, and learned how to counter German infiltration tactics. German armored thrusts that would have shattered American lines in February were now being blunted or repelled entirely. By May, the Allies launched a final series of offensives across Tunisia. 2 corps pushed east, while British and French forces attacked from other directions. The Axis front steadily collapsed. On May 7th, American and British units reached Bizerte and Tunis. By May 13th, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. More than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners, an even larger surrender than Stalingrad. The same American troops who had been overrun at Sidi Bou Zid just 12 weeks earlier were now part of the force that delivered a decisive theater-ending victory. The turnaround was so dramatic that many historians still point to Kasserine as a prime example of accelerated battlefield learning. It showed how quickly American units could absorb lessons, reorganize, and return to the fight with new effectiveness. That speed of adaptation became a defining characteristic of U.S. forces for the rest of the war. In Sicily, the pattern repeated. Initial tactical confusion gave way to coordinated operations. In Italy, American units again improved rapidly after early setbacks, and by the time of Normandy, American formations were among the best trained, best equipped, and most capable in the Allied army. Although Rommel never fought Americans again after Kasserine, what he observed there shaped his view of the war's future. He had already calculated that Germany could not match Allied industrial capacity. American factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at levels Germany simply couldn't reach. Allied shipping kept supplies flowing across the Atlantic. American training and replacement systems replenished losses far faster than Germany could. Rommel believed that once Allied forces established a permanent foothold in Western Europe, Germany would not be able to push them out. The only chance was to stop the landings at the beaches before the Allies could build up strength. That view came directly from what he had seen in Tunisia. He had watched American soldiers recover from chaos, reorganize, and fight effectively within days. He knew that once they gained a stable position, their numerical and logistical advantages would overwhelm any German tactical superiority. Rommel tried to convince Hitler and the German High Command that the Allies should be fought at the waterline. If they were allowed to spread inland and supply themselves freely, the German army would eventually be forced into retreat after retreat, just as in North Africa. German leaders ignored him. They believed American troops were fundamentally inferior, and that their early setbacks proved it. Many officers dismissed the final phase of Kasserine as a fluke or credited terrain rather than American skill. They clung to the illusion of German tactical superiority long after it ceased to matter. That refusal to acknowledge the reality Rommel saw became one of Germany's greatest strategic failures. When the Normandy invasion finally came, Rommel was not at his command post. He was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. By the time he returned, the Allies had dug in and were rapidly bringing ashore reinforcements, tanks, artillery, and supplies. Rommel immediately recognized the situation he had feared. The Allied foothold was solid. The massive American logistical machine was unloading thousands of tons of material every day. Germany would never push them back. It was the same pattern he had witnessed in Tunisia, except this time Germany had no space to trade and no hope of recovery. Rommel was severely wounded in July when his staff car was attacked from the air. While recovering, he was implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Facing a show trial that would endanger his family, he chose suicide on October 14, 1944. He was 52. His assessments of American forces, written soon after Kasserine, remained in German military files and were rediscovered after the war. They were remarkably accurate. He understood the Americans' weaknesses but also their strengths, especially their capacity to learn quickly and to turn raw potential into battlefield capability. He recognized that such an army, backed by a vast industrial base, would eventually overpower Germany. Meanwhile, Paul Robinett survived his injury later in 1943, though his combat career ended after his leg was badly damaged by artillery fire. He went on to command the armored school at Fort Knox but never became widely known for the defensive stand he organized east of Tébessa. The history of Kasserine often focused on the early disasters rather than the final stand that stopped Rommel's advance. Yet that stand was what prevented the Americans from losing far more. It was Robinett's preparation, careful positioning, and coordination that halted the Afrika Korps at a moment when another breakthrough would have been disastrous. George Patton understood this. When he took over 2 corps, he met Robinett and studied every detail of the defense. Many of the techniques Robinett used, integrated arms, deliberate positioning, pre-registered artillery fire, became standard practice across Patton's entire command. These principles shaped how American forces fought for the rest of the war. The transformation of 2 corps under Patton unfolded with remarkable speed. During March and April 1943, he reshaped the force from a shaken, disorganized collection of units into a cohesive army capable of coordinated offensive action. His insistence on discipline restored order. His demand for clear chains of command eliminated confusion. And his relentless training cycles integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, and supporting units into a unified fighting system, something that had been missing during the early battles at Sidi Bou Zid and Sbeitla. Patton's reforms turned into results almost immediately. At Gafsa and later at El Guettar, the Americans demonstrated the kind of synchronized combined arms operation that the Germans had expected to encounter weeks earlier. Forward observers worked closely with infantry companies to guide artillery fire with far greater accuracy. Tank destroyer battalions adopted new tactics, using ambush positions and cooperating with infantry instead of charging tanks head-on. Infantry units learned to advance with more caution, using cover, fire support, and communication to avoid being isolated and overrun. The turning point came on March 23rd, when the 10th Panzer Division attacked American positions at El Ghokar. It was the same German formation that had shattered U.S. armor at Sidi Bou Zid. But this time the Americans were prepared. Artillery pounded the German assembly areas even before the panzers advanced. Tank destroyers waited in hull-down positions and picked off German armor as it crossed open terrain. Infantry guarded the flanks and prevented infiltration. Within hours, the German attack unraveled. Dozens of panzers were destroyed, and the survivors withdrew. For the first time, American troops had decisively defeated a major German armored assault. This victory confirmed everything Rommel had predicted after Kasserine. Once American units had time to learn, reorganize, and properly coordinate their weapons, they became formidable. Throughout late March and April, German counterattacks repeatedly failed against well-prepared American defensive lines, backed by massive artillery support. The U.S. ability to move supplies, replace equipment, and rotate units kept pressure on the Axis forces, who were increasingly short on fuel, ammunition, and manpower. By May 1943, the German and Italian forces in Tunisia were collapsing. Surrounded by Allied armies on multiple fronts and cut off from resupply, they surrendered in staggering numbers. In total, more than 275,000 Axis troops were captured. What had begun in February as a humiliating American defeat had ended 12 weeks later as a triumphant Allied success and a clear demonstration of the strategic advantage the Americans brought to the war, overwhelming logistics and an unmatched ability to adapt. Rommel, despite not commanding in the final battles, watched these developments closely. From Germany, he followed the reports and saw confirmation of the conclusions he had drawn at Kasserine. He understood that the Americans possessed three strengths Germany could not counter: industrial production on a scale unmatched by any Axis nation, logistics that could sustain operations across continents, and a military culture capable of absorbing mistakes rapidly and turning them into improvements. These insights shaped his later views of the war's direction. When he prepared for the Allied invasion of France, he argued repeatedly that Germany's only realistic chance was to defeat the invasion immediately at the beaches. If the Allies were allowed to move inland, build supply dumps, and deploy their overwhelming firepower, Germany would eventually be forced backwards step by step, just as had happened in North Africa. Most German commanders disagreed. They believed the Americans were inexperienced and brittle, basing their confidence on the first days of Kasserine while ignoring what followed. They underestimated the speed at which American units learned and adapted, and they overestimated their own ability to recover from losses. Rommel saw a very different picture: an enemy that improved with every engagement and whose industrial might would crush Germany in a prolonged attritional fight. He was proven correct. After the Normandy landings, once the Allies established strong supply lines, the German army was steadily pushed back. No amount of tactical skill could overcome the weight of Allied material and the growing competence of American forces. Meanwhile, Paul Robinett's role at Kasserine remained largely unrecognized. The spotlight stayed on Patton's reforms and on the early failures of II Corps. The defensive stand that actually halted Rommel's advance was overshadowed. Yet Robinett's preparation was the model on which later American tactics were built. His understanding of the terrain, his coordinated use of tanks, infantry, and artillery, and his deliberate defensive planning proved that American forces could fight effectively when properly organized. These lessons influenced the entire American approach to warfare for the rest of World War II. They shaped operations in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. The concept of integrated combined arms, tanks supported by infantry supported by artillery, all tied together by communication, became a defining principle of American ground warfare. Kasserine Pass, therefore, remains a paradox in history. It was a tactical defeat, but a strategic milestone. It exposed American weaknesses brutally, but forced rapid improvement. And it convinced at least one German commander that the Americans would eventually become one of the most dangerous opponents Germany had ever faced. After the battle, Rommel's judgment of American potential remained recorded in reports that were largely ignored by the German High Command. He had warned them that the Americans were not weak, only inexperienced, and that their ability to adapt made them a long-term threat. Few listened. Hitler and many senior officers clung to the early images of burning Shermans at Sidi Bou Zid and disorganized retreats through mountain passes. They dismissed the later stages of Kasserine as unimportant or accidental and convinced themselves the Americans could always be beaten with aggressive tactics and seasoned German troops. That miscalculation would influence German decisions for the rest of the war. But Rommel remembered the transformation he had seen in those final 2 days. He remembered how American units recovered after breaking. He remembered how their artillery had shut down entire attacks, how their defensive positions were suddenly coherent and coordinated, how the chaos of the early battles vanished once they were properly led and positioned. He knew that any army capable of learning that much in 72 hours would only grow stronger with time. Patton, meanwhile, applied every lesson Robinett had demonstrated. His insistence on discipline, clarity of mission and combined arms integration became the foundation on which the U.S. Army rebuilt itself. By May, 2 corps had gone from a force in retreat to one spearheading the final Allied drive across Tunisia. They captured thousands of prisoners, seized key towns, and entered Bizerte as German resistance collapsed. The same soldiers who had stumbled at Kasserine were now fighting with confidence and precision. The broader pattern continued across Europe. In Sicily, American forces faced initial challenges but quickly adjusted and pushed through German defenses. In Italy, they learned to fight in mountainous terrain and conducted complex assaults with increasing skill. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, American units were among the most capable Allied formations. They operated massive artillery networks, coordinated armor and infantry seamlessly, and relied on logistic systems unmatched by any nation in the world. Rommel saw this coming. His warnings, recorded in German archives, reflected his understanding that Allied strength lay not just in numbers, but in a capacity to absorb losses and transform them into future success. He calculated that Germany could not win a long war against such an opponent. The only chance was to stop the Allies before they could bring their full weight ashore. When that chance was lost in Normandy, he knew the strategic defeat was inevitable. His career ended abruptly after he was implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Forced to choose between trial and suicide, he ended his life in October 1944. His assessments, however, survived and would later help historians understand why Germany's early victories could not be sustained. Paul Robinett survived the war as well. Though overshadowed by more famous names, his stand east of Tébessa played a crucial role in preventing a complete collapse of 2 corps. His careful reading of terrain, his coordination of tanks, infantry, and artillery, and his ability to organize a coherent defense out of battered units showed what American forces could accomplish under competent leadership. Patton studied his methods closely and used them as the blueprint for rebuilding the entire corps. Yet Robinett's contributions remained largely forgotten in popular memory. The narrative of Kasserine focused on embarrassment and defeat, often skipping the moment when the American defense finally held. But the truth is that Robinett's stand bought the time needed for 2 corps to reorganize. Without it, Patton would have inherited a shattered force instead of one that had already begun to stabilize. The larger lesson of Kasserine is that military performance is not fixed. Armies are shaped by leadership, preparation, and their willingness to learn. The Americans in early February 1943 were untested and uncoordinated. The Americans by late March were a different force entirely. They had endured failure, extracted lessons from it, and used those lessons to rebuild themselves into a capable fighting machine. Rommel understood this better than most. He recognized that the Americans' industrial strength and logistical reach were only part of the equation. Their true advantage was adaptability. Once they learned how to fight the Germans on equal terms, they would bring overwhelming material superiority to bear. And once they brought that superiority to the battlefield, no amount of German tactical brilliance could change the outcome. Kasserine Pass therefore stands today not just as a story of defeat or victory, but as a moment of transformation. It revealed American weaknesses, but more importantly, it revealed American potential. It showed how quickly an inexperienced army could absorb hard lessons and turn them into future success. And it stands as a reminder that one battle can teach more than it costs, if the lessons are understood and applied. The field where Robinett fought is quiet now. The Wadis and ridge lines still exist, unchanged since 1943. Cars pass through without realizing what happened there. The pass where Rommel advanced is now just a highway. Almost nothing marks the place where an army was broken, rebuilt, and reborn. But the lessons remain clear. Leadership matters, preparation matters. Combined arms coordination matters. Realistic self-assessment matters. And the ability to learn quickly can change the course of a war. At Kasserine, those ideas collided violently. The Americans suffered terribly, adapted rapidly, and emerged stronger. Rommel recognized